Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Paula Whitaker, a member of the board of the Alexandra Historical Society. And on this cold winter night, we are delighted to be gathering virtually as Rebecca Rose and Cassandra Good share their research about women in the American Revolution. For many of us, what we learned about women in the Revolution started and ended with Betsy Ross. Wrong, very wrong. Rebecca and Cassandra will discuss how recent scholarship is reshaping our understanding of the Revolutionary era to include the role of women. They'll also touch on how they turned their research into new entries for Virginia Humanities Encyclopedia Virginia, which is a great free resource if you do not already know it. We are also pleased to offer this session as no charge as a kickoff to our America 250th commemoration. Donations, of course, are always welcome, and we'll put a link to our PayPal giving fund in the chat, as well as to our membership page if you'd like to join or renew. I'll introduce both Rebecca and Cassandra up front, and they will each speak for about 20 minutes or so. After both presentations, we'll take questions, so please put questions in the chat. First, Rebecca will share her work on women in the Revolutionary War Army. Rebecca has a master's degree in history from Virginia Commonwealth University. She's a past board member and secretary of the Alexandra Historical Society. We lost her when she had the audacity to both work and live across the river, but I'm really pleased she's come back to us, at least for tonight. Cassandra will focus on the political engagement of women on the home front. A historian of early American gender, culture, and politics, she received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and is associate professor of history at Marymount University. She's the author of Founding Friendships, Friendships Between Men and Women in the Early American Republic, and First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America. Her work has also been featured by institutions including the Library of Congress, Smithsonian, and Museum of the American Revolution. So we'll hear from Rebecca first, then Cassandra. And again, if you have questions, put them in the chat. Thanks so much.
Okay. So my name is Rebecca Rose, and tonight I get to talk to you about my most recent entry for Encyclopedia Virginia. And that entry focuses on women of the Army in the American Revolution. You may be more familiar with the term camp followers, and we'll discuss those terms a little bit as we continue. I don't know how many people in the audience are already familiar with Encyclopedia Virginia, but it's a great scholarly resource for almost articles on almost any topic you can think of in Virginia history. And since this is a behind the scenes event, I'm going to pull back the curtain a little bit in addition to talking about the content of the article. On my research and writing process so everyone can get a sense of, at least for me, how things look on the contributor end of Encyclopedia Virginia. I first started using Encyclopedia Virginia, which is a bit of a mouthful, so I might start calling it EV, as an undergraduate history major. And a professor of mine actually had us write entries as an assignment for class. And eventually that's how I got hooked up with Patricia Miller, who's the current editor of Encyclopedia Virginia, and who I'll also just say has been a great source of mentorship and advice over the years as I've grown as a writer and historian. So to give you a sense of how long these articles incubate, at least for me, and I think Dr. Good will provide a good contrast with her process. The genesis of this article on women of the Army actually came about 2.5 years ago. I reached out to Patty Miller in the summer of 2023 to see if any writing opportunities were available, and we were already gearing up for America 250, so she asked me if I'd be willing to cover this topic. I finished the draft in March 2024, and the article was published in May 2025. So I finished the draft. It goes off to Encyclopedia Virginia to go through their review process, to pull images. In fact, most of the images in my slide deck were pulled from the Encyclopedia Virginia article, and all of those things. And then it was published in May 2025, so a little over a year after I had finished my part of the writing and research. And I will I'm currently on the hook for another article, and I don't want to know how long that one's going to take. It's mostly finished, but it's been mostly finished for a while. Um, so what takes so long? And what did the research and writing process look like for this piece? Um, so I was assigned the topic Women of the Army in the American Revolution. I am not a specialist in this era. It's an encyclopedia entry. So my job was really to find the best secondary sources that I could and pull those together for a general audience. Um, and the fun and challenging part of any Encyclopedia Virginia entry on a broad topic like this is figuring out the unique Virginia angle. So, what, if any, unique contributions did Virginia women make to the Continental Army? And what was the experience of women attached to the Army in Virginia? And those questions really had to guide my research. And as for the writing process, that was reading a whole bunch of different sources, making a lot of notes, putting those in a Google Doc, and then eventually turning that into an article format. And we do get contributors get guidelines from Encyclopedia Virginia telling us really how to structure the piece, and also asking that we come up with a list of suggested illustrations, suggested sources, that kind of go into guiding, in addition to things like word count, how the final piece takes shape. So when I was researching this and I was thinking, okay, women of the Army, I how do I find the Virginia angle on this? I started with historians like Holly Mayer, Nancy Lone, John U. Reese, all of whom have done incredible work digging into Continental Army records, private letters and diaries, and other sources for information on these women of the Army, women who followed the Continental Army during the American Revolution. But of course, none of them was writing about Virginia women in particular. So it was really a matter for me of reading all these sources, looking at those footnotes, digging up the primary sources where I could, where they were, available to find online or otherwise published or accessible, and hunting for details on Virginians and Virginia. So really quick, I want to get into the term camp followers versus women of the Army, because one of my real guiding stars when I was writing this book, I was not writing a book. I was writing an Encyclopedia Virginia article. And I was using the 1996 book by historian Holly Mayer, Belonging to the Army, Camp Followers and Community During the American Revolution. So she was one of the first historians to really look seriously at this topic, and I had the pleasure of meeting her. She spoke a few months ago at Anderson House in DC. And I introduced myself and I told her about this article, and she was so pleased that Encyclopedia Virginia had made the editorial decision to use the term women of the Army, which is the term that George Washington used to describe the women who were attached to the Continental Army during the war, as opposed to camp followers, which later picked up connotations of prostitution, which I don't know if anyone in the audience sort of had that mental link. Honestly, I did when I was assigned the topic. And as we'll discuss, most of the female camp followers or the women of the Army of the Revolutionary War were the wives of soldiers. And they performed labor like cooking and laundry, which in later conflicts were professionalized and became sort of part and parcel of the military. So as it became less normal for wives to join husbands on campaign, the women who followed army encampments in later conflicts or who hung around army encampments were less likely to have a stable, permanent connection to a specific soldier. And I think that's really why we have that connotation with camp followers as something sort of illicit. Now, during the Revolution, likely hundreds of Virginia women followed the Army. Exact numbers are sort of hard to pinpoint from surviving Continental Army returns. And like I said, most of these women were the wives of soldiers. Many soldiers did not have the means to support their families, so that their wives really had no choice but to join them on campaign to receive rations for themselves and for their children. And I'm going to change the background here. As another behind the scenes look, this was an image, a sketch that was uncovered in a desk drawer in New Jersey a few years ago, and the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia has it. And this is one of the two surviving illustrations, contemporary illustrations we have of camp followers or women of the Army during the American Revolution. These are women of the North Carolina Brigade. And this circa 1777, we have this illustration that was, as I said, discovered a few years ago. And I was very excited because I think this was news articles came out as I was writing in the research process, and we got to have this beautiful high resolution image in the article. So as you can get a sense of from this image, most of the women who are attached to the Army, they are not very well off. They are doing this because they have no choice. This is how they are able to support themselves and their families. Thinking about Virginia specifically, frontier violence in the West or British raids in the East may have led some Virginia soldiers' wives to become camp followers. Other female attendants were paid servants in the households of officers. And of course, enslaved Virginia women truly had no choice whether or not they were going to go on campaign. We also have evidence from runaway newspaper ads during the Revolutionary War that indentured servants and enslaved women joined the Army voluntarily, whether out of a pre-existing relationship with a soldier or to pursue whatever economic opportunities were available to them if they followed the Army as cooks or laundresses. So that's most female camp followers. They're or women of the Army. It's sort of difficult to keep the terminology separate because what they are literally doing is following Army encampments. But these women of the Army, they were, as the vestryman of Williamsburg's Bruton Parish Church put it in 1777, quote, necessary attendants on the camp, end quote, performing essential labor for their husbands or their employers, but also, quote, the poorest sort of our people, end quote. And this was in 1777. There was an Army encampment in around the Williamsburg area, and the vestrymen, the muckety mucks of Williamsburg, were really concerned that the parish was going to have to support these women, which is how dire those economic circumstances were. George Washington himself considered women to be a clog on the efficiency of the Army, especially when they rode on baggage wagons, as pictured here. Washington issued, I think, about 25 orders concerning women during the Revolutionary War. And I want to say maybe even half of them were about women riding on baggage wagons and how they should not be allowed to do that because they would exhaust the horses. But Washington also recognized that the presence of wives was necessary for morale, not only because of the comfort and care they provided, but also because a man who knew that his family couldn't put bread on the table at home was unlikely to stay with the Army. We also have a very different category of women of the Army, and that is officers' wives. And in fact, in my opinion, the most famous woman of the Army of the American Revolution, in my opinion, is a Virginian, none other than Martha Washington. And the next AHS Zoom, I believe, is about Martha Washington and how she spent the Revolutionary War. So stay tuned for that one if you want more detail on the most glamorous woman of the Army during the American Revolution. Officers' wives, like General Washington's wife, tended to make seasonal visits to their husbands when the Army was not on active campaign, and they usually lived in more comfortable lodging outside of the main encampment, unlike the vast majority of women of the Army who are living in camp. Also, unlike ordinary soldiers' wives, these women typically did not wash, cook, or nurse wounded soldiers. Instead, they attempted to boost the Army's morale by hosting social events such as balls and dinners for officers and for visiting dignitaries. This allowed their husbands more time to focus on military planning and administration rather than social obligations. So less gritty than the work of the majority of women of the Army, but it was still necessary labor to keep the Army running. For most women, of course, camp life was difficult and dirty. Dependent women typically received one ration a day from the Army, but unless they were specifically employed by the Army as laundresses, nurses, or cooks, women also did not earn money for the labor they performed for their families. So they are really uncompensated except for bed and board. Now, Continental commanders also wanted to keep women far away from combat. In addition to wanting to keep them off the baggage wagons, there was a concern that women were going to encumber the Army on active campaign. However, we do have instances of women cooking for soldiers on the battlefield, bringing soldiers water during battle, and on very rare occasions, serving in combat themselves throughout the war. And I mentioned a few scattered instances, and I now want to talk a little bit specifically about one woman's experience of combat in Virginia. She was not a Virginian, but she followed her husband down to Virginia during the Yorktown campaign, the final campaign of the war. And also dig into one type of source we have regarding these women's lives, which is pension records. This is another little behind the scenes peek. Dr. Good and I actually spoke after our first, this is our second time, my second time getting to be her opening act. We did another event and we talked about these pension records. And so I figured I would bring a little bit of that behind the scenes insight into this talk. So following the passage of 1836 legislation, which made Revolutionary War widows eligible for pensions, women who could prove they were married to a Continental Army or militia soldier before the end of the American Revolution in 1783 could give testimony before their local court of record that would then be submitted to the War Department for review. They would testify, I was married to a soldier during the Revolution. May I have a pension and or a land bounty? The National Park Service actually describes these pension applications as America's first great oral history project. These are really the last remnants of the revolutionary generation, giving their memories of the war. Both these widows who are allowed to receive pensions after 1836 and prior to that, veterans themselves who were eligible for pensions, I believe, after 1818. So one of these applicants was New Yorker Sarah Osborne, who, as I said, she marched with her second husband's company from Philadelphia to Virginia during the Yorktown campaign. And she left behind her impressions of that campaign to posterity when she applied for a government pension in 1837. So right after that law allowing Revolutionary War widows to receive pensions was passed. And after we spoke in preparation of tonight's event, Dr. Good actually sent me an article by Riley Sutherland, who's a PhD candidate at Harvard, about Osborne's pension application. So I had previously discussed Sarah Osborne and her experience at Yorktown, but I did not know that there was another historian who had written an entire article about Osborne's pension application. So as I mentioned, this is 1837. She's giving testimony to her local court of record in Pennsylvania. And what Riley Sutherland does in her article is discuss the political context in which Osborne made her application and why she may have chosen to emphasize certain memories of her time with the Army. So when we think about these pension applications, we have to remember they're taken down several decades after the fact. They're being constructed for a specific purpose, to get a pension, to prove, yes, I was married to a soldier, I suffered along with him, and I'm eligible for a pension and a land bounty. And they may have been tailored for their audience. They go to their local court of record, their local judges, they may know their judges' political leanings. And so these widows, these applicants may be tailoring their narratives in certain ways. So let's keep that in mind as we talk about Sarah Osborne's story and her Virginia connection. So sometimes on foot, and sometimes even allowed the privilege of traveling by horse or wagon, Sarah Osborne baked bread and washed clothing for her husband during the march down to Virginia. Once at Yorktown, she and the three other women attached to her husband's company stayed, according to her recollection, stayed just behind the American tents, and they brought food to soldiers in the redoubts during the siege of Yorktown. And Sarah Osborne, in her 1837 testimony, in her pension application, she actually recounted meeting General Washington at Yorktown, who asked her whether she was not afraid of the cannon shot from the British. And Osborne was not. She joked that British bullets would not cheat the gallows that the enemy would prepare for unsuccessful revolutionaries. And she added it would not do for the men to fight and starve too. Osborne recounted cooking for soldiers on the day of Cornwallis's surrender, pictured here, and became an eyewitness to the event. So, in terms of constructing a narrative to make her eligible for a pension, Sarah Osborne was right there in the siege of, or at the surrender, Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, and met George Washington. Now, George Washington, as far as I know, never wrote about this exchange with Sarah Osborne. But nevertheless, it's a really fascinating glimpse into the kinds of sources we have available. And a very, she's not a Virginia woman of the Army, but she was a woman of the Army who was in Virginia at really a seminal moment in the war, the very end of the war. So to sum up, women helped keep the Continental Army running through their physical labor and emotional support, like Sarah Osborne, who cooked and washed and even cooked for soldiers on the day of the surrender, and recalled saying that, it's not going to do for the men to fight and starve too, so she doesn't even worry about being in the line of fire. And George Washington explained in 1783, at the end of the war, that when faced with the hungry families of soldiers whose homes had been destroyed by the British, he was, quote, obliged to give provisions to the extra women or lose by desertion some of the oldest and best soldiers in the service, end quote. Virginia's women of the Army played a crucial role in supporting the Continental Army during the American Revolution. They washed clothes, they nursed the sick and wounded, provided essential sustenance by cooking for soldiers, and organized other forms of entertainment and support for soldiers according to their resources, like Martha Washington. And most importantly, perhaps, or certainly most importantly, for the outcome of the American Revolution, their presence helped ensure that the men that they followed stayed with the Army all the way up until the end of the war. So that concludes my behind-the-scenes peek into women of the Army and the American Revolution, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. Now we're going to move a little bit away from the camps and hear from Cassandra.
All right. Are you seeing my slides okay? Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to step back a little bit from the war itself to talk more broadly about the era and the way women were involved politically in this era in Virginia. And in terms of my writing this piece, it's a little bit different in terms of how I was coming at it than Rebecca, because I, in fact, have been studying women's political participation in early America for like 20 years at this point. And so it's one of those things where it's like, okay, I know I've read X at some point. What book is it in? And where can I find the primary source to highlight? And I had not written specifically just about Virginia before, but I think actually there's a lot of really good material from women in Virginia in this period. So I'm just going to give you a sense of some of the topics I covered in the entry. And it sort of starts chronologically with the imperial crisis and the lead up to the war itself. And women are very involved at this point. You're seeing an image of the Virginia Gazette, the state's official newspaper. And it was edited by a woman named Clementina Rind. After the death of her husband, she took over editing the newspaper. And she covered stories on the protests, and they definitely had a patriotic slant. Newspapers were not expected to maintain objectivity at this point, and she did not. She also included articles urging women in particular to participate in boycotts. And in addition, her printing office published an important pamphlet by Thomas Jefferson. So these boycotts, we know a fair amount about them from newspaper reporting, and um, we've always known with these that women are key purchasers. And so with a boycott, you really have to appeal to the people doing the shopping, and that is women. And so there were also articles by men urging women to participate or praising them for doing so. The other component to that boycott is if you're not going to buy, for instance, imported cloth, and there is very little cloth made in America at this point, you're going to do homespun, basically making that fabric at home. And so we see a number of women doing that, and those clothes really show their political commitment to the revolution. Here's a woman whose clothing also gives us some hint of her political views because actually that blue silk knot that she is wearing near her neck was a symbol of support for the Sons of Liberty. We also know the book is open to page 92, which is a reference to the Glorious 92, or the 92 delegates in the Massachusetts House who voted to protest the Stamp Act in 1768. So this is an image where if we look at it today, we would not see anything overtly political. But at the time this was painted, that iconography would have been apparent to people. And one of the great things that Encyclopedia Virginia does is they have a person whose job it is to find images for these articles. So, in fact, it was Catherine Garrett, that editor, who found this portrait, which I had not seen before until she found it for my article. And so there's really rich imagery available in this source, too. I'm not going to talk too much about women's involvement in the war because we really heard a lot about that from Rebecca, but just to say that even if they are not leaving home during the war, their support of the home front is important, and they end up often controlling their household, their farm, the business of the house. Um, Again, some of them are accompanying their husbands, including, as we heard, Martha Washington. And I thought I'd include here a pincushion that she made supposedly while, trying to make the time pass while at the winter camp with George Washington and the troops. And then, of course, there's women serving as nurses that are sort of on official military roles. They are getting paid, although they are getting paid less than male nurses. Nursing is not at this point considered a female profession. Another thing that women could do to be politically engaged at this point and involved in the war was participate in fundraising efforts. And there was a national effort by women that was organized by a woman named Esther DeBert Reed in Philadelphia. And this was to raise money and use that money to help pay the troops because they were not getting paid. That was the original plan with the money. As it turned out, Washington was worried that these soldiers would spend the money on alcohol. And so he requested that instead that money be used to buy linen for shirts that the women could sew, which they did. And they sewed their names into those shirts. And among the women fundraising for this, so each state had women leading the effort. And in Virginia, Martha Washington and Martha Jefferson were both a big part of that effort. And we have very few surviving letters from Martha Jefferson. And this is one of those few surviving letters where she's talking about the fact that she is undertaking this duty with cheerfulness, and that is giving women a way to really participate in this patriotic movement. We also have women that do not side with the Patriots. And I put loyalists with a question mark here because it was not always clear what a woman's allegiances were. If a woman's husband was a loyalist, she was often assumed to be a loyalist. But as we know, spouses don't always agree on things. So there were times where there were men that were loyalists and their wives declared themselves to be patriots, or at least they tried not to take a position at all. So this woman here, Mary Willing Bird in Virginia, she was suspected of being a loyalist because her husband was a suspected loyalist who had died by suicide. And she wrote letters to the governor of Virginia defending her conduct after she had been accused of offering support to the enemy. And she said, I assure you, no action of my life has been inconsistent with the character of a virtuous American. I cannot express violent, enthusiastic opinions and wish curses and destruction on the meanest individual on earth. It is against my religion. I wish well to all mankind, to America in particular. What am I but an American? All my friends and connections are in America. My whole property is here. Could I wish ill to everything I have an interest in? So basically, she's saying, like, of course, I am a patriot, but I also am not going to be cruel to an opposing soldier. That's basically how she's excusing that idea that she supported the enemy. We also have enslaved women who, we can think about this as a political act in some sense, that they took advantage of the opportunity of the absence of enslavers from plantations, or especially in Virginia, of Lord Dunmore's proclamation that offered freedom to any enslaved people in Virginia that made it to the British lines. And so what we're seeing here is a list of enslaved women, enslaved people that had fled Mount Vernon, George Washington's Mount Vernon, from the war, three of whom were women. So you can see here they included Lucy and Esther, who we know were both subsequently recaptured and returned to Mount Vernon in 1781. The third woman there, Deborah, we believe her full name was Deborah Squash, managed to evade being recaptured and was taken by the British to Nova Scotia with other enslaved people who made it to British lines. Unfortunately, it's hard to follow people once they got to Nova Scotia, but we know that conditions in Nova Scotia were really pretty poor. The local people in Nova Scotia did not welcome the newcomers. And that is a whole other pretty interesting story, I think. To get more directly to political ideology here, I think when we think about women in the Revolution, we often think of this famous quote from Abigail Adams, where she tells John Adams, "Remember the ladies." And people use that as a shorthand for, women should have political rights. That is actually not what Abigail Adams was saying. That letter, if you read that in context and read the full letter, it's more about the fact that she is worried about legal protections for married women against abuse of their husbands. So it's not really certainly not an ask about voting. And it's pretty rare to find women at this time mentioning in writing that they want to be able to vote. Probably the two best examples we have of this actually come from women in Virginia. There was one woman named Lucy Ludwell Paradise who asked Jefferson in a letter for a law in Virginia to protect women's finances from husbands' exploitation. So this is not exactly asking for a vote, but it is lobbying, not just please protect us, but please pass a law that does this specific thing. And we also have an account. We have a response to a letter from a woman named Hannah Lee Corbin. She wrote her brother, Richard Henry Lee, in 1778, and we don't have that original letter, but we have the response from which we can get a sense of what she said to him. He says, "You complain that widows are not represented and that being temporary possessors of their estates ought not to be liable to the tax." Basically, she's saying taxation without representation. And he says, forbidding widows having property from voting, notwithstanding it has never been the practice either here or in England, maybe that doesn't make sense. Perhaps it was thought rather out of character for women to press into those tumultuous assemblies of men where the business of choosing representatives is conducted. All voting is done in person by voice at this point, so election days were rowdy, alcohol-filled places, and that's what he's referring to. But the fact is that this is one of the only cases we have where clearly a woman was saying, I should be represented because I pay taxes. Mary Willing Bird also notes, I pay taxes and I don't have representation. And that is, you're seeing a clip. I have paid my taxes and have not been personally or virtually represented. My property is taken from me and I have no redress. Right? So we have several different Virginia women politicking pretty directly here. And that sort of sets the stage for women's political role after the war. We usually refer to this role after the war as the Republican wife or the Republican mother, not relating to the political party Republican, but the small r Republican, which is about virtue and representation. And so here you have Eleanor Parke Custis Lewis, or Nellie Custis, Martha Washington's granddaughter. And this is a portrait of her at the National Gallery of Art. She says at one point in the 1790s, as a teenager, I am becoming an outrageous politician. She was very partisan. She was a Federalist. She hated Jefferson and his party and called them those animals. We also see here Elizabeth Monroe, who in the 1790s, when she and her husband James were on a diplomatic mission in France, helped the Marquis de Lafayette's wife escape from prison. And it was through some strategic maneuvering on her part. So I want to suggest in part, so this we have this famous painting here of Washington resigning his commission from the US Capitol. I wonder how often people notice that there are women in this image. You see several, a mother and young girls on the floor, and then women and a handful of young women in the balcony. But this also raises the issue of sources that Rebecca was getting at, and sources that are done long after the fact. So that's supposed to be Martha Washington and her granddaughters. However, Martha wasn't there at the time of his resigning his commission. The granddaughters weren't there, and they also were a lot younger. If they had been there, these girls in the balcony or in this overlook area are too old to have been them. And Trumbull knew the Washingtons and the granddaughters, and he had to know that they weren't there. So it's interesting that he's making a decision to tell a particular story and include them. And that's, I think, the case with so many of the records we have from the Revolution that are recorded in the 1820s and 30s, and people are looking back and may have a particular message that they want to get across, even if it's a pension application. We assume that that's just a factual, recording of facts, but we know how fallible people's memories are. And we also know that people, most those pensions didn't get approved. And so you really had to, work hard to get the attention of the government officials looking at your application. So I will wrap it up there so that we have time for some questions. Happy to talk about sources, and Rebecca and I can both answer questions. Oh, and I wanted to show you this close-up of Martha and the granddaughters that are the wrong age. But finally, just here is my email address if anybody wants to get in touch afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Again, if you have a question, please put it in the chat. One that came up already, and you sort of referred to it, Cassandra, but I'm not sure if there's any more information about the chances of people actually getting pensions, particularly women getting the pensions, the widows getting the pensions. Do either of you know anything about the likelihood of of success and
I
kind of who made the decision?
I don't know the stats on that or if anybody has calculated it. There's actually been a lot more research on Civil War pensions than Revolutionary War pensions. And I assume there were multiple different acts passed And then there's different states. Um, all of these have, there's like 80,000 applications. And it is marked whether they get granted or not. In a lot of cases, you'll see marking that's like, need more information. And so that person then had to get, especially if it's a woman, you had to prove you had been married to this guy during the war at a time before there were official marriage records. So there may be stats out there, but I tend to doubt it. It was challenging, especially for women, to get these.
Did Sarah get her pension, Rebecca?
Trying to remember what happened with her application. I think she
Believe
did,
so.
right?
Yeah, I believe so. And she went on to live until 1855, 1854, 1855, I believe, and was something of a local celebrity where she lived, which is where the illustration that I have of her
Like
came from. But
a
thank,
100-year-old woman.
yeah,
Well, no, I think it says
109.
109, right? Which the other thing about that is I don't think that's right either, because there's this huge fad at this time of people claiming to be over 100 years old. Um, and as we know from if anybody's familiar with the Blue Zones thing, like that has now been shown that the main characteristic that all the Blue Zones share is places where people don't have good records of their birth dates. And so most of those people are not super old. And I suspect it's sort of a similar, you got some status from saying you were 109.
Yeah.
And
Another thing that came up was anything about spies who were women. Do either of you have any, kind of, anything to share about, I guess either for either side, really?
Did you have anything on that, Rebecca?
I have a few things that I ran across. Again, maybe not with a specific Virginia connection, but uh, one of the reasons that sometimes women of the Army were not welcomed with open arms by official uh, Army authorities was um, that the more women are around, and especially if they're kind of itinerant, the more opportunities you have for espionage, including, I think there was at least one case of a woman who posed as a peddler in a Continental Army camp and then reported back to the British. So that is definitely one concern. And women were also women in encampments were pretty heavily scrutinized by military authorities to make sure they had a legitimate connection to a soldier. Um, and in part, that is one of the concerns was maybe that they might be spies. And then women could also be spies in a way that was helpful to the Continental Army. Um, such as there were a few instances of women, wives of soldiers, laundresses, who reported brewing mutinies in the Continental Army to commanders. So that's sort of an intra-Continental Army kind of espionage. But yes, I ran across a few instances of that.
Yeah, and I'll put in here the link. So we mentioned the person who wrote that new article on Sarah Osborne Benjamin, Riley Sutherland. She also wrote the sort of like overview of Virginia women during the Revolution piece for the Encyclopedia. And I was looking back at that, and she doesn't have anything on spies in there, which I'm guessing is because she couldn't find any verifiable stories. Because, yeah, some of those stories, it's like, did this happen or not? Because again, it's from the 1830s. There clearly were some women who were spies. Like that example you were talking about, I've heard of too, Rebecca, I think in New York. But
Mhm.
yeah, my guess is that nobody's found a confirmable one from Virginia if there's not, because Riley was very thorough in that entry. And yeah, I mean, there's even, there are like statues to this woman, Sybil Luddington, who was supposed to be the female Paul Revere, and yet there's no evidence that that story happened.
That's
Same
been
with
sort of a
Nancy
more
Hart in
recent,
Georgia.
yeah, huh. That's been a more recent thing that I've heard, the female Paul Revere, quote unquote. Somebody asked about, oh yeah, who assisted Lafayette's escape, and that was Elizabeth Monroe. But even that's pretty crazy when you think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And Tim McGrath's biography of James Monroe would have more detail on this. I also encourage people, if you have not been to Highland, James Monroe's Highland in Charlottesville, he built that, oh, there we go. There's the
Yeah.
book. So
Yeah.
the house at Highland was not actually his house, as it turns out. However, he was living on that plot of land, and the interpretation they're doing there is fantastic. And if you've been to Monticello but haven't been to Highland, really recommend going.
And that's just a couple hours away as well, right? Because I have
I've
not.
definitely
I need
done
to put
the
on my
drive
list.
there and back in a day, so
Yeah.
it's
Okay.
doable.
Yeah. I've been wondering about, you talked about these individual women and their, um, trying to get some sort of maybe rights because they're taxpayers or what have you. But I mean, do you have any sense of whether, there was any even loose organization of women, kind of talking these issues among themselves or,
No, not
yeah,
that I have ever seen any sign of. I mean, that the Mary Willing Bird and Hannah Lee Corbin Lee, or Lee Corbin taxation without, like, those are even the only written examples I have ever seen of women making that argument that early. You do have women that are organizing in the 19th century that make that argument, and some of them refuse to pay taxes uh, because of this. Um, so I think like Lucy Stone does that at a certain point, but I don't think the argument for those women was not that like all women should have the vote. It was more at that time, anybody who owned property could vote, and they were like, I own property. That's why I should be able to vote.
right. Interesting. So what are you working on now? Do you have anything that you want to share with folks about any, kind of research or publication project?
I mean, I can jump in on that. I don't know what
Yeah,
Rebecca,
then
did
I
you
can
want
ask Rebecca what
to
your
also,
next
yeah.
entry is if you're
So
willing to share it. So
yeah, well, the 19th century example is a good transition to that because my project right now is looking at women political operators in the antebellum period and the extent to which women, like way more than the Republican wife and mother thing, are basically becoming lobbyists and power brokers. Not a lot of women, but some of them who are actually helping get laws passed and using their writing, especially as newspaper editors, to influence legislation. So that's what I've been working on.
and Rebecca, can you share what your entry is that you've been sort of almost done with for a while?
Yes. So I have been working on dress in the American Revolution,
Oh,
um,
cool.
with that Virginia focus. So that's been a really fun project. But there have just been other other intervening things and projects at work. But stay tuned if you want to know how Virginia women and Virginia men were dressing in the American Revolution and some of the unique Virginia contributions to Continental Army uniforms.
Oh, gosh. So, any last call for any questions? Put them in the chat or get in touch afterwards if you want to. Cassandra has her email up, and please read her books. Let's see. Did anyone notice a difference of participation for women? In the western part of the state versus the eastern in Virginia.
I think they're just not that. I mean,
That was the front.
the
That was
question is
a
what counts as West at this point? Like,
yeah.
I mean, like Winchester was pretty far west at that point, I would say. And I'm trying to think, like, I, I don't know, Rebecca, if you came across, like, there just aren't that many people living
That
very
was really
far from the coast
the
yet.
far outskirts. Yeah, that was the outskirts.
Yeah, I think certainly for political participation um, at the highest levels, you're really not going to see anyone from,
The west.
yeah.
Right.
And in terms of women of the Army, the Virginia specific records are just, I don't think um, the surviving records are really rich enough and strong enough in information about individuals to be able to make any kind of broad statements like that. But it's a really interesting question, and hopefully at some point, that's a question that someone can find a way to answer.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank everybody for joining, and a special thanks to Rebecca and to Cassandra for this great evening. The talks will be posted on YouTube in the near future. And just a reminder, we have a full schedule of programs, both online and in person, throughout 2026. They both mentioned that our next Zoom talk and behind the scenes talk is going to be a focus on Martha Washington, with Mary V. Thompson, who is the research historian emerita at Mount Vernon. So, we're going to get a great presentation. On March 9th, Ken Bancroft will look at the revolution from the other side through the diary of a loyalist named Nicholas Cresswell, who spent some time in Alexandria. So that will be great. If you're not already a member, we urge you to join Alexandria Historical Society to support these and many other programs. You can go to our website for a full schedule of events, for back issues of the Alexandria Chronicle, and for other resources. So we'll send out the link for the YouTube, and also, again, welcome your involvement and thank you for your time tonight.